are the afflictions of the righteous. Now, understand that. It's going to be that way. You're going to have opposition all the days of your life. You're never going to get away from that. Because the devil, as a roaring lion, is going about seeking whom he may devour. And if you can put yourself between these two areas, I think it will help you a lot. I think of my own life. The Lord was at work in my family before I was born. My mother's father was saved in a little Baptist church in their community, and he immediately began to intercede for his wife and for all of his children. And then my father needed a place to stay before he and my mother were married, and so they permitted him to stay at their home, and he was influenced by the prayer life and the sincerity and the honesty of my grandfather, who never felt like he accomplished very much, but at the same time he represented a life that was beyond what my father knew. My father was very wicked in his young years. His father died when he was 12 years old in the flu epidemic, and as a result of that, his mother remarried, married a half-uncle, and his father's half-brother. They didn't get along. My father left home at about 14 years old and went to work for a farmer for room and board. And from those years on, he was wicked. He was ungodly. He got involved in alcohol. He was immoral. All these things were taking place in his life. And all the while, Satan was attempting to destroy him. But God was at work. On one side, he had Grandpa Bishop, who was trying to witness to my father and to the family. And on the other side, Satan was attempting to create all of the ungodly appetites and stir up the corruptness in his nature and cause him to long for and lust after the things of the world. And he dove in head over heels. Well, he married my mother, and they wound up having two boys. A third son was born, and that little boy contracted pneumonia. He was a brother just older than me. And here again, the devil was at work with his destructive purposes. He came to rob, destroy, and steal. Okay? He does everything he can to try to destroy God's purpose and God's intent. Well, that brother just older than me died in February, and I was born in June of the year my other brother died. So now there are 3 sons in the family. I'm the youngest one of those sons. My father continued to be immoral. He continued to carouse. My mother, after the death of my brother took place, she became very nervous. She had a nervous breakdown. Her eyesight went bad. She almost went blind. And all the while, my father is carousing and becoming more miserable and more miserable and more miserable. And one day, he received a letter from a cousin who had moved to Los Angeles, California. And this cousin said, we have found a church, and we think the answer to all the longings that are within us. Why don't you come out? And so my father spoke to my mother about it, and she was anxious to do something different because life was miserable for her. So they loaded up the family, these 3 boys, and headed for California. I was 18 months old when that took place. And so what was happening here? Well, the Holy Spirit was at work. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. He was drawing my father. He was drawing my family. And he's reaching out, always at work in the lives of others to save them, seeking to save them. And so my family arrived in California, and when they got in there on Sunday afternoon, when they arrived at my father's cousin's house, just after they had had their noon meal, my father said they walked in the kitchen and they saw beer bottles sitting on the table. My father said I was so discouraged when I saw those beer bottles because he knew alcohol was part of his problem. It was something uncontrolled for him. And he said when I saw those beer bottles on the table, I knew they didn't have anything I needed. But they took the family in and gave them a place to stay, and told my parents, we have been going to Angelus Temple, where Amy Simple McPherson was preaching. And so the cousin asked my father and mother to go, and why not? So they went. And my mother heard Amy Simple McPherson preach a simple salvation message. And she was so distraught. She was so hungry. She was so broken. She was looking for answers to the problems. And here this preacher was saying, Jesus can change your life and make you a new creature. My mother went to the altar and gave her heart to the Lord. So Jesus is seeking. He's reaching for the family. My father didn't go to the altar. He wasn't a whole lot interested in that at this point in time. But my mother was desirous to want to know the Lord. And so some neighbors asked them to come to church. They went to an Assembly of God church there in Los Angeles, California. And my mother was just so thrilled to have the fellowship of the saints. My father was not. He was a little lukewarm towards it. He wasn't convinced at all that this was what they ought to be doing. And yet the people in the church, and I want to encourage you, I don't know that my family would have survived spiritually had it hadn't been for families in that church who took interest in them. And so when my father would say to mother, I don't think we'll go to church on Sunday, I'd like to go for a drive or do something else, somebody would show up at the house the day before. And they'd say, now, Brother Canter, we want you to come to church. Sister Canter, come to church. And I don't know if we're going to make it or not. Oh, I tell you what, we're planning dinner for you. We'd like for you to come and come to church and then have dinner with us. And so, okay, they did that, kept them in church another Sunday. Okay, and this was a process that was going on week after week. A different family would invite them to come. What's happening? Jesus is seeking to save that which is lost. Amen. And he was motivating other believers to have an interest in my family. I probably wouldn't be saved tonight had it not been for the fact that somebody whose name is not known. I know a few of the family names that were in that church back then, but many of those people's names I don't know, but heaven has it down. As Brother Taylor said, heaven knows, amen, who those people were, who continued to interest them and asked them to come to church. And one family one week, another family the next week, until the process was going on. Jesus was reaching to save the family. And so over a period of time after going to church, mother was joyous. Her whole countenance changed. She was doing well physically. And my father was working nights. And he, to backtrack just a little bit, during this period of time, he had a habit. On Saturday afternoon, he would take a carton of Coke bottles, empty Coke bottles, and a carton of beer bottles, and he would take them to the little store across a vacant lot and buy 6 bottles of beer and 6 bottles of Coke. And Mom and the boys would drink the Coke over the weekend, and he would drink the 6 bottles of beer. Well, he started across this lot one day, and he said he heard his name called, Mitchell. And he stopped and looked around. He thought, nobody knows me here. He was, he didn't have any friends in California. And so he started on again, and he heard his name called again, Mitchell. And he stopped again, and he looked around, trying to see if there was somebody that was calling him, and he didn't see anyone, so he started on. And then he said, within him, these words came to him. He said, he had said this some months before, if I had a good job and if I had money to buy clothes for my children, I would take my family to church. Now that was something he said in himself. And so as he was going on across the vacant lot, these words came back to him. You said that if you got a good job and you were able to buy clothes for your family, that you'd take your family to church. And he got to thinking about that. And he said, I didn't say that to anybody. I only was talking to myself when I said that. And then he said, the only one that could know that is God. So when he got back to the house, he had 6 Coke in one hand and 6 Coke in the other hand. He didn't buy beer because if God saw him going across there, he didn't want him to see him come back with beer. And he didn't tell my mother what was going on. She saw and she wondered what was happening. Well, he was working nights, and one day after having slept in the morning, he woke up and he turned the radio on, and Charles Fuller was on the radio, and he was preaching the old-fashioned gospel hour, I think is what they called it, preached a message on salvation. And when he came to the end, he said, now maybe you're hearing this broadcast and you're thinking in your heart, if there's a God, I'd really like to know. I'm not sure there's a God, but if there's a God, I'd really like to know him. And if there is a God, I would really like him to make a difference in my life. And my dad thought, that's me. I don't know. Is there really a God? He'd seen so much hypocrisy and so forth, as most people have. And I don't know if that's the case. So the preacher said, well, if that's how you feel, he said, you pray with me. And so he prayed this prayer. He said, God, if there is a God, I'm coming to you with an honest heart. And I'm asking you that if you exist, that you do something in my life, that you change my life, that you let me know who you are. And so when the preacher finished and said amen, my dad said he didn't feel anything. He didn't see anything, no lights flashing or no thrills or no bells going off or whistles or whatever. And he got up out of bed. And when he went out on the porch, my mother was outside hanging clothes on the clothesline. And he said, she looked more beautiful to me than I'd ever noticed before. And he said, the sky looked bluer and the grass looked greener. And from that, he said, something has changed. Something is different in my life. Well, they kept going to church. My dad was still smoking. He liked to smoke a pipe. And he testified in church that he'd given his heart to the Lord. And so the brothers in the church began to say, now, Brother Canter, you need to stop smoking. No, the Lord doesn't want you to smoke. He doesn't want you to put that kind of stuff in your body. And my dad said, well, if the Lord would tell me not to smoke anymore, I wouldn't. And so he was at work one night, and after he had his meal, he reached in his dinner bucket and got his pipe out. And he knocked the old dried ashes out of it, and he said he put it in his mouth. And when he drew air through that, he said it was so nasty that it almost made him gag. And he thought of what the preacher said about unclean vessels. And he said, if this thing is this nasty and God doesn't want something unclean in his people's life, then I need to get rid of it. So he took the pipe out of his mouth, and about 8 feet away was a 55-gallon drum they used for trash. He gave it a pitch towards that drum and hit the inside rim, made a couple circles around and hit the bottom. And my father never smoked another time after that. Now, what we're talking about? We're talking about the Lord seeking to save the lost. But all the while, my father's still wrestling. He's wrestling with the old appetites. He's wrestling with his old corrupt nature. And the devil is doing everything he can to bring about destruction. We were driving through the city one day, and my father went through a area where the stop sign was in his favor, but somebody ran the stop sign coming the other way, and he hit that other car, T-boned it. And I was standing, remember I'm about 2 years old now, I'm standing between my mother and dad in the front seat of this Model A Ford when he hit that car. And I was projected towards the windshield. I hit the windshield, broke a collarbone, and cut my ear in two here. And my father said he was just able to grab my ankles before I went on out the windshield. Now, what was happening? The devil is going about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But Jesus is on the other side, seeking to save that which is lost. Are you hearing me? In the first decade of my life, I faced something that could have taken my life. How wonderful the Lord was to preserve me. And in my first decade of my life, I had a couple of experiences that could have taken my life. My older brother at 14 died with a kidney infection or a kidney disease. And after he died, just a few months, I came down with the same disease. And my mother was terrified. She was afraid that I was going to die too. They called all the church people in and asked them to pray. And God miraculously intervened. Doctor told her, said what he has usually comes in 3 attacks.